I'm John Buchanan, and what we're going to start by doing in this episode is to pick up where we finished in the last episode, which is with this track. Now, the subject of that episode was all about what we can do to make pad layers dynamic. In other words, rather than just pads that take up loads of space and sustain and just occupy loads of our concentration when we're listening back to a piece of music, we can get them moving in various ways. So do go and check out that episode if you're interested to know how we ended up here. Now, what we're going to do this week is to add a kind of extra oscillator to our pad landscape, if you like. Now, that might be an odd thing for me to say, bearing in mind the sounds are coming from Alchemy and that's not really a synthesizer that allows us just to dial in another oscillator in a regular way like a subtractive synthesizer might. But effectively what we can do is to almost imagine another synth providing a kind of noise generator which has the potential to just rough sounds up a little bit. Now, noise is central to our experience of listening to pieces of music. Without any noise, music has this cold, slightly digital quality. We're always looking for bit crushers and distortion units and hardware synthesizers that have just got a little bit of crackle or hiss in the way that they produce sounds. We plug in microphones and we like the fact that we kind of get unpredictability and some kind of dirt in our recordings a little bit because it's central to the experience of making music. You don't need to be a rock guitarist to know that, although that helps. So effectively what I want to do is to introduce a noise generator to make part of the pad world of this sound, just to make things a little bit less angelic and just a little bit kind of rougher. Okay, now the way that I'm going to do that is to fire up a brand new instrument. And there are loads of Logic synthesizers that have the potential to produce some white noise for us. For example, the ES2. This old school synthesizer that exists within Logic, which has been there forever, has got a white noise generator. And in fact, I made a video many centuries ago about white noise risers, which used retro synth to generate some white noise for us. We're going to go even more old school, and we're going to come to the ESP for this example. And there she is. Okay, what I'm going to do is to turn off all of the oscillators that aren't the white noise, and what I'm going to do is to turn the white noise generator up. Now, effectively, I'm going to just mind my volume for a moment, because you never know, do you? Less nice. Okay, so the reason why this white noise is so biting and kind of horrible, and I've stopped here without taking your ears off, is because resonance is up. I'm going to just turn that down. And the reason why we're getting a kind of spike of white noise rather than a sustained layer of it is because the envelope for this instrument at the moment has no sustain level. So I'm going to turn sustain up to maximum. And it's good because it's not in any way like that dial is in any way heavily pixelated. Wow. Okay. Then what we're going to do is to turn overdrive down as well. I warned you. I hope you adjusted your volume a little bit. Otherwise, Will might be able to help us there. Okay, so we've turned the overdrive down, and effectively now what we've got, hopefully, is a slightly less aggressive sound. I've also got a volume control here, so I could be a little bit more cautious. Off to the beach we go. Okay, so we've got some noise generation and we've got our cutoff frequency, which is controlling which frequencies we can hear. It's a low pass filter that we're listening to here, which means we always get the low frequency content. And as I push this frequency dial, the cutoff dial up, effectively we let through more high frequencies. And as a result, what we get is this kind of undulating sort of sound. Okay, now the next part, I kind of just need to record a really long note, which is going to occupy the entire length of this pad line. And it's going to take me 16 bars to do that if I'm not careful. Well, I don't want to do that. What I'm going to do instead is to press T, bring up my little toolbox of options. I'm going to make a 16 note region, or 16 bar region, I should say, not 16 notes. I'm going to double click on it and I'm going to create an event, a note event specifically, using my pencil tool again, right at the beginning. Although it doesn't really want to go right at the beginning. So let's just extend that out of bar 2. So it's right at the beginning. And then I'm going to force legato that, shift and backslash. And that is going to make that note last as long as the region does. Therefore, I get 16 bars of solid white noise. Okay, and because the filter is down, we're hearing that as this kind of sort of low rumbly layer, effectively. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to experiment to see what happens when I put this white noise layer, we should label it so we know what it is. There is no white color. I suppose that's about as close as I'm going to get. So let's do that. Let's just rename the region. And what I'm going to do is to move this into the pads. Now, by dragging this layer up into this track stack, effectively, immediately this white noise layer will be assigned to the same bus routing as the other pads within this track stack. So effectively, the white noise has just gone in to become part of the experience of that collection of sounds. And the benefit of that is that because on the pads track stack, I've got my gating, which is producing the kind of overall shape, and we've got our compression treatment, and we've got reverb and delay. Immediately, just by moving that white noise layer in there, it's going to pick up all of those settings that are part of the experience of that world, making it feel like it was part of the pad layer all along. So just by itself, if I put that in with the trigger, what we're going to hear is the gating that is being applied to this white noise layer. There it is. And if we run it with the other pads, we'll hear the experience of having this kind of slightly dusty layer added to this otherwise angelic collection of sounds. But of course, it's getting completely drowned out. So what we need to do is to reopen the ESP and to draw some of that sort of frequency information in that we were just experimenting with when we first fired up this layer. And we'll just begin to see what happens when we contour that alongside some of the movement we've got elsewhere within this track as well. So I'm going to just come into soloing the pads and soloing the trigger. And I'll come out of track solo mode so that effectively what we've got is all of the pads playing with the trigger as well. And what we should discover is that effectively what we've got a chance to do is to just draw some of the cutoff frequency information in that we want, just to kind of make this a little bit more dynamic. So what we've now got is a white noise layer that exists with the pads, and it's providing this kind of dirt and this crackle, and it's just a bit noisier and it feels quite nice. But what if what I wanted to do is to be a little bit more sophisticated about the way that this layer was added alongside the pads? In other words, I kind of want it to have independent gating and compression from the pads. I like the idea of it being part of the pad world, but I just want it to have a little bit of its own thing going on too. So what I'm going to do is to take this white noise layer and I'm going to take it down here outside of the track stack. And the moment I do that, Logic reassigns its output, so it's going straight to the stereo output now, as opposed to the pads, which are being routed through to bus 4 into this track stack. So now it stands alone. It's its own thing. It's like it's left home and become its own independent white noise sound source. Might have taken that a bit too far. Okay, what I'm going to do instead is to fire up another noise gate. And because I've recently used the noise gate, it's in my list of 5 most recently used plugins. I'm going to fire it up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to again use the input trigger, which is coming from an instrument, and I've labeled it trigger so I know exactly what it is. Now this is going to now behave just like it does on the pads. In fact, let's mute the pads for a moment. So we're just hearing how the noise gate sounds on the white noise layer. Now, one thing I'm doing is I'm adjusting the threshold point. And what that's doing is, if I push it high enough, eventually reaching a point where the trigger isn't loud enough to open up the gate. So we're getting some of them, but not all of them. And I think that might be quite interesting. I don't want quite as small a number as I've got at the moment. I'm going to experiment in 1 dB slices where I can get to see how many of these are kind of allowed through. Remember, the trigger itself is made up of a combination of different hi-hat sounds, and they're going to be at different volumes. So of course it makes sense that some of them won't get through and others will. Okay, that feels like it might be quite good. What I'm going to do is put it back in with the pads. Now remember, the pads are getting the same trigger, but at a lower threshold. So they're playing all the time. Every single time the trigger happens, they are triggering the pads. And the white noise is now being added selectively to the trigger points that are loud enough. And that's really interesting. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to feed that white noise layer in to the reverb and to the delay, so that effectively they're entering, or this sound is entering the same space that the pads are in. Let's just see what that sounds like. And what I'm also going to do is to feed the drum loop in as a compressor sidechain input source, which I'm also doing on the pads. So what this allows me to do is to go and find the drum loop that is part of this track as well, and to feed that in as a compression sidechain trigger for the white noise. So again, this is something I did on the pads, but I've got the potential here, of course, to have slightly different settings. So I could make this more extreme from a ratio perspective. And again, I can drop the threshold. So we've got a lot of this happening whenever the pad sound happens. Now, the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to also just, in fact, manipulate a relatively quick release and a really fast attack. And the last thing I'm going to do is again experiment, as I did with the pads, to see what happens if I vary the release time. Now this effectively controls how long it takes for the noise gate to close. So effectively, as the release time gets shorter, we get really short little spikes, and as we open it up, we get longer little blasts of sound. That's amazing, particularly with these really extreme settings. We get this almost like a kind of brushed snare kind of thing happening because we're getting all of those extreme dynamic changes. And in fact, actually, I'm quite enjoying this longer release time because we're getting few of these actual blasts of sound. We can afford for the release time to kind of be fixed and be a bit longer so that we just hear it when we hear it. Let's put that in with the rest of the mix. I'm just going to turn this layer up a little bit in volume just so we can really make the point. I think I've changed my mind. I think I probably would automate that parameter and just have some variation. And do go and watch the previous episode to find out how I did that on the pads. So the thing about white noise is it basically just makes everything a little bit less clean and a little bit less digital. There are loads of ways that we can use it just to introduce a kind of noise, well, literally a noise layer into our tracks. And effectively what I've done here is to kind of add an extra oscillator to the sounds that contribute to the pad world. I've decoupled that relationship by taking the sound out of the pad track stack and giving it its own version of the parameters that I'm using on that pad. And that's a kind of sophisticated mix idea. The idea that I might just create something that's got its own set of controls based around really similar ones on other sounds within the mix. And it's just a way of making the whole thing a little bit more sophisticated. White noise, it's your friend.